Welcome to the Political Philosophy Podcast. This episode is one of my personal favourite types of episodes to do, which is a conversation between two writers who've both covered a topic recently, both read each other's work, reflecting together on what they've learned doing it, asking each other questions, and just having an open-ended, long-form discussion on it. My guest today is Greg Sargent, who's a staff writer at the New Republic, and he's been covering American politics for over 2 decades now, also written for Washington Post, Talking Points Memo, New York Magazine, host of others. And we've both written recently that as horrific as what we're seeing from ICE is in the States and the real profound costs of immigration enforcement, that we are also witnessing a moment of overreach from the right, and that there is an opportunity for liberals to go on the attack here and to reclaim the immigration issue and reset some of the narratives that we have about it. It's a conversation in two parts. The first part is what are we up against, and what what is the ideology that we're confronting here in the form of people like Stephen Miller, and then the second is what do we do about it, and what is our long run plan here. So let's get straight into it. I really enjoyed having this conversation. It was in some points bleak, but I think by the end, hopefully, cautiously, guardedly optimistic. This is How Liberals Win on Immigration with Greg Sargent. I'm joined today by Greg Sargent. Greg, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So, can I start with your Stephen Miller piece? And let's maybe just start at the absolute basics, maybe for my audience is both British and American, but maybe for the British who won't know this person, who is Stephen Miller and what sort of an agenda is he bringing to the Trump White House?
Well, Stephen Miller is probably the most influential Deputy White House Chief of Staff that we've ever seen, certainly in modern times. He's a top assistant to the president, and his brief is immigration. If there's any figure who is more central to Donald Trump's immigration agenda than Stephen Miller, I don't know who that is. Stephen Miller is restrictionist and has very clear white nationalist sympathies. And he has been waiting for a moment like this for many years. Just to bring your audience up on the very basics, he was born in California. He kind of fell in with some right-wing thinkers during high school. And he ended up working on Capitol Hill for a restrictionist senator named Jeff Sessions, who ended up working for Trump during his first term. Then Stephen Miller kind of grafted himself onto Trump and became his chief immigration whisperer, as it were. And he has essentially urged Donald Trump at every turn to be as cruel and sadistic to immigrants as possible. And he is essentially the architect of everything your audience is seeing right now on their phones, on their Instagrams, on television. The ICE brutality, the ICE shootings, the snatchings on the street, the masked kidnappings, all of that is Stephen Miller. And he is enormously powerful, and he has an immense amount of money at his disposal, tens and tens of billions of dollars, which were handed over by Congress to carry out mass deportations, mass expulsions, as it were. And he is currently in the process of doing that. All this social discord and searing social conflict on the streets is the product of his agenda.
What's he trying to achieve? What's his vision of what America should look like?
So for Stephen Miller, the United States started to go into the shitter in 1965 because we passed a law, the 1965 Immigration Act, which undid racial quotas on immigration that had been put in place in 1924. The 1965 Act essentially opened up the United States to immigration from around the world. And to him, he has said this publicly in various places, that act has inflicted enormous damage to the country in the form of eroding its social cohesion, its communities, crime, every social ill that you could possibly imagine in the United States, in Stephen Miller's mind, is the cause of this mass migration. And his main project, as we wrote in this piece at tnr.com, you can check it out, his main project is to undo the world that the 1965 Immigration Act made. And to that end, he's carrying out mass expulsions of ordinary people who have lived in the United States for, in some cases, many years or even decades, have very deep ties to communities and families here, have jobs, have lives here. And just to underscore the searing kind of tensions and violence you're seeing in US society right now are the cause of all that, of Stephen Miller's desire to ethnically re-engineer the country, in essence, to undo the impacts of the 1965 Act. That's the simplest way I know how to put it.
What's your critique of that? And I know that sounds like a question that perhaps one shouldn't have to ask, what's wrong with ethnic cleansing? But you tried to, I think, construct an argument, not just that in some sense this couldn't work. What's your case against Stephen Miller?
Okay, well, there are a number of levels that we could do this on,
It's a big
and
question. Take your time with it. Go through
okay,
a
I'll
few
take.
points.
Well, let's chat about one piece of this at a time. Like, let's start with the claim that the 1965 Act is when everything started to go wrong in the United States. The 1965 Act ended racial quotas on immigration, and racial quotas on immigration were a stain on the country, as much as Stephen Miller thinks that they were a great thing. And it's simply not true empirically, theoretically, in any sense that mass immigration has had the sort of social impacts that he has ascribed to it. So, at the most fundamental level, the diagnosis is all wrong. I can even give you a specific example of this. He has been known to tweet that the period of net negative migration in the United States, which roughly is a couple of decades after the passage of the 1924 Act, which imposed racial quotas on immigration, he's tweeted that that was a golden age in the US, as if net negative migration is the reason for the United States' post-war success. And of course, that's absolutely absurd. There are many other reasons that the United States was a relatively egalitarian, high growth society in aftermath of World War II left Europe in ruins and allowed the United States to kind of become the leading industrial powerhouse for a time. Another reason for it is high taxes on the rich, which are now gone. The taxes on the rich that persisted during those years. A third reason is strong unions, also gone. So things that Stephen Miller absolutely hates, high taxes on the rich, strong unions, those are the things that at least played a part in the United States' post-war success, not an end to mass immigration. So that's one point on which he's completely wrong. The other point
Can I interject with a question there?
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Do you think that, I mean, answer it either for Stephen Miller or people with this sort of project in general. Do you think they know that they're lying? Because there's a lot of small falsehoods here, but it seems to me like the whole sort of extreme anti-immigrant thing is built around this big falsehood that immigrants are violent and dangerous. And just every study in every country for 30, 40 years now has shown that first generation immigrants commit violent crimes at either somewhat or significantly lower rates than the native born population. And like my answer's a bit of a weird one on this, is like for the hardcore fascist, it's not like they think, oh, here I am telling a lie. It's that they don't care. They have a vision of a racially pure society, and everything else just comes secondary to that. But some people think that there's, I don't know, what do you think of that? Do you think in their heads they're aware that they're saying stuff that isn't true? Or I don't know, because it does seem to me like it's so interesting. Our world has been moved by these movements that their core assertions are empirically false.
Yeah, so I think it's a little hard to answer that question. I'm going to try to articulate a theory as to why. I
Yeah, I
think
mean, I
people
ask
like,
it because it's one I sort of go back and forth with myself.
right. No, I know. And of course, you guys are struggling with the same stuff, right?
Yes, certainly, certainly, and I might throw in a transatlantic question towards the end. But yes, I mean, it's global. Like the sort of modern far right has global aspirations, and you see that very clearly in the case of Elon Musk, who, I mean, would be another one I could put the same question to. He says things that are that are just not only factually untrue, but hopelessly factually untrue.
Yeah.
Like, does he know that he's lying? And my answer is he doesn't care. Like, truth is not important to these people in a way that I think
Right. I
liberals
would put
struggle to understand.
right. I would put a slightly different spin on the idea that truth isn't important to them. I think they just think about truth and lies differently from the way you and I think about truth and lies. For them, a lot of the stuff is purely instrumental, but that to you and me, that sounds bad, right? Like, he uses a bunch of lies in order to demonize immigrants, in order to build public support for putting them in prison camps in enormous numbers and deporting them without due process, right? Like, so that's Stephen Miller's use of the lie. But to him, the idea that you would instrumentally use a lie toward an end like or set of ends like the ones that he is trying to bring about is a good thing, right? He doesn't feel like he has to honor the liberal desire for truth and empiricism. He thinks that liberals like you and me are either hopelessly deluded about the long-term prognosis of the country or actively trying to bring down the country. And so instrumental lying in service of saving the country in his head is is admirable and positive. Does that make sense to you? Like he just doesn't it doesn't enter into his equation whether that he has any kind of obligation to empirical truth.
It does. It does. I almost feel like with the real, and I think Miller, Musk are like true believers. With the real true believers in this project, the core truth is that there are immutable racial differences, and then all other truths have to like organize themselves around that, as weird as that sounds.
Yes. Yes, I think that's exactly right. And to Stephen Miller, the core truth is that the country cannot survive in conditions of ethnic pluralism on the levels that it currently has.
Right,
And
that's something
that's the core
they
truth.
reason from, not reason to. It's not like they came to that conclusion with facts. That's their starting point. And then,
Right, I think that's exactly it. And it's the only way you can understand the depth of commitment to their project. I don't know if you there was a really interesting moment during Stephen Miller's speech at Charlie Kirk's memorial recently. And Stephen Miller was seizing on the murder of Charlie Kirk. For your audience, well, I guess everyone will know, but Charlie Kirk is a major Christian nationalist thinker, a major MAGA type, who was shot by a young assassin a few months back. And to Miller, that looked to him like the kind of Reichstag moment where he would be able to finally unite the right with the center toward the project of unleashing state crackdown, of state violence and I guess, subjugation on the liberal elements in the country that are trying to bring it down with mass migration. And what he said during that speech was something like, I'll paraphrase, the enemy is nothing. The enemy doesn't understand the depth of our resolve. And I took that line, which is somewhat chilling, to really reflect what his actual state of mind and set of ideas, set of operational ideologies really is, which is that you and I are nothing and the enemy, and that he is justified in pushing the power of the state and breaking the law and stretching it in every conceivable which way to subjugate us and prevent us from, continuing to advocate for pluralism and immigration and liberal democracy. And I don't really know what that leaves us with, but that is as close as I can get to understanding what's going on in his head.
I think it also reflects a belief that you saw with the mid 20th century fascists, you see with this lot, that liberalism won't fight back, that we don't really believe it, that it's sort of like a
Yes.
racism is sort of like a social affectation. It's not sincere belief. Um, I did sort
Yes.
of I did we can perhaps return to that thought, but I did sort of interrupt you as we did the sort of first set of reasons, as it were, why we might disagree with Mr. Miller, of that these are not
Right.
factual claims and this is not a sort of true diagnosis of America's ills. You're going to move on to a second set.
Okay. There's a deep set of ideological problems with the actual program that he's pursuing right now. So to Stephen Miller and to J.D. Vance and to others in that space, in the I guess authoritarian white nationalist space, is basically one shorthand for it. To them, any person who came into the country illegally is permanently marked as a criminal. There's no point at which they can get right with the law. There's no there's no reasonable way to grant them any kind of amnesty because there's no innocence once that has happened. Miller has been somewhat explicit on this point. He said things like, if you have unauthorized migration, you don't have a civilization, right? In our piece, we run through a number of quotes like that, where he essentially says that one of the primary threats to social cohesion, to community, to communal bonds among Americans, is the the unauthorized entry into the country of people from Central and South America and elsewhere. Right? To him, there's no coming back from that crime, and I think most ordinary people intuitively understand what's wrong with that, which is fundamentally that when people come here, even illegally, and start living their lives, taking jobs, contributing to the US economy, becoming part of US communities, developing social ties to Americans, and so forth, those people are, in essence, developing a claim to belonging. Now, you know, to Miller, that is absolute heresy. I think this is an essential difference with someone like Stephen Miller and J.D. Vance. It is absolute heresy to say that anyone who came into the country illegally can develop a legitimate claim to belonging. And he sees that as, in addition to a threat to all the other things that I listed before, social cohesion, communal ties, and all that, he sees it as a threat to national sovereignty, which he holds up in his head as, something that is an extremely high ideal, maybe almost a sacred concept. I don't know much about Miller's personal religious views, I will say that. But he is imbued with this kind of fanaticism about the concept of national sovereignty. There are all kinds of things that are wrong with the picture of sovereignty that he develops, but even if you put that aside, right, most ordinary people don't agree with him. To them, like, let me just, can I be permitted a quick aside here?
Of course.
Well, so, lots of people on your side of the water probably know who Joe Rogan is, and I don't know if they know it or not, but Joe Rogan has, endorsed Trump. He's kind of MAGA friendly in certain respects. He's MAGA adjacent, maybe. He represents kind of a world of male podcasters and audiences that is, kind of, I don't know, that bleeds into MAGA in some ways. Donald Trump made major inroads with young men in the 2024 election. A big reason for that is this kind of existence of this information ecosystem where people like Rogan and their audiences exist. There are lots of others like Rogan, but he's probably the biggest, right? And in a surprise to a lot of people here, Joe Rogan has turned rather viciously on Donald Trump over the mass deportations. And if you listen to his language, Joe Rogan's, I mean, you can start to see what's wrong with Stephen Miller's view, because to Joe Rogan, it's intuitively obvious to him that you don't remove people who have been here a long time, right? He doesn't feel any need to justify that. He doesn't feel a need to rebut the idea, the theoretical set of claims that Miller makes. He just sees it as intuitively right. And I think we should, try to take something from those intuitions and learn something from them. I think most people understand that someone who is trying to get here just to better their lives, right, is really not committing an act of serious violence or crime against the country. This is something Miller cannot accept, right? And so, given the fundamental unseriousness of their offense, if they over time demonstrate goodwill toward the country, toward its people, meaning the United States, most ordinary people understand them to be developing a claim to amnesty. And this, I think, is really at the core of why Miller's agenda is being so roundly rejected, in addition to the fact that his paramilitary militias are shooting people in the face. I think that Americans are kind of realizing that these intuitions are really something that have real force. Does that make sense?
It does. I would also, though, say that the type of evolution that is typified by Joe Rogan, but I think is far from unique to him, does reflect a significant failing, both in the electorate, in the news media, and to some degree in the opposition party, the Democrats, because I think so, I think what you see in general is electorates sort of behaving in the sort of Joe Rogan path that you outlined, in that they will be attracted to the idea of, oh, there's too many immigrants and we need to deport the criminals, and they'll vote for that. And then
Yes.
once the reality of it becomes manifest, they'll be like, oh, whoa, I didn't mean this. And I think, you could partly attribute that to like people using language in different ways. When Stephen Miller says we're going to deport all the criminals, what he means is anybody who came to the country without proper documentation. And actually,
Yeah.
I think honestly, what they mean sometimes when they say criminals is all non-white immigrants. They're just using it as a stand-in for that. But when the average voter, I don't know, perhaps Joe Rogan hears we're going to deport all the criminals, what they hear is we're going to deport immigrants who are like gang members and committing crimes. And so when it turns out that criminals was actually meant much more broadly, people have this like, oh, whoa, that's not what I meant type of thing. But I guess I have a frustration or a critique with a lot of people in sort of, I agree that it's good that people are turning on the project now, But I think we might say there was a failure of voters to really interrogate what these platforms were and how radical and sweeping that they were. And I think they just went with their laziest, most benign instinct. I think there was a failure of news media to really sort of say, to really sort of impress on the electorate, this is what it would mean for this to be enacted. And there was some of that, but just not enough. And I don't think it broke through. Now, the media would say it's not our job to campaign for a party, and sure, but it is your job to make people aware of like what the consequences of certain platforms would be. And I think that was failed. And I think to some degree was failed by the Democrats, who on this issue, and perhaps we can come to this, are a lot better than some centre-left parties we might mention. But I think they just didn't want to talk about immigration very much. They felt it wasn't a strong issue for them, and so the more time they could spend talking about something else, the better. But like all of that, if you added up, meant that people were making a choice, both because I think a lot of people were being lazy and incurious, but also because they hadn't really been properly informed on that choice without because these consequences were perfectly predictable, and many of us did predict them. And I think it speaks to multiple overlapping failures, both on the part of individuals, but also on the part of systems like the Democratic Party and the media, that we've reached this point where people are now going, whoa, that's not what we meant, but it was what they meant. Does that all make sense?
Yes, and I agree with all of it, 100%. I just want to focus on a couple key elements of it.
Please, I talked for a
So,
while.
uh, so, so this idea that people like Joe Rogan and normies, as they're sometimes called, meaning normal everyday voters, understood criminal to mean something different from Stephen Miller. That's true, but it's also true that they actually do differ on a deeper ideological level about what constitutes a criminal alien, as it were. So, Stephen Miller and the White House constantly use the phrase criminal illegal alien or illegal alien criminal. So in their formulation, as I mentioned earlier, all people who cross illegally, no matter how long they've stayed here, no matter what they've contributed to the U.S. economy and to local communities, no matter how deep their social ties, no matter how well-meaning they are toward American institutions, no matter how beloved, or no matter how much they respect and cherish American institutions. By the way, we should note that immigrants actually do like American institutions. Data shows that. But no matter how much they contribute, they're still criminal, right? And so when Joe Rogan says, these people don't deserve what they're getting, it's an actual difference with Stephen Miller over what desert dictates here. Like Stephen Miller really believes it's a civilizational crime, a crime against the country, a crime against national sovereignty to cross borders illegally to try to better one's life. And that's just not intuitively what most people understand the situation to be, right? Human life is pretty damn messy. People move. They sometimes have a series of bad choices in life. They pick the best of a series of bad choices. They take a risk, maybe by crossing a border illegally and starting a new life because, they don't have another option that's better. And in many cases, the other options are really horrifically worse. And I think really a lot of people understand this. And I'm going to say something that people might disagree with, but I think even Donald Trump probably understands this in a way that Stephen Miller does not. Um, you know,
I
actually,
think Trump is an old school racist, and I think So I don't know. I'm always a bit leery of like trying to understand what's people in people's heads. Here's what I think Donald Trump thinks. I think, do you think that family coming from Haiti, let's just say they didn't come here legally, do you think that's an understandable decision on their part? I think Trump would say, sure, sure, people want what's good for themselves. I don't argue with that.
Yes,
But
exactly.
I think he would also say, Haitians just aren't as smart or as capable as Americans, and I don't want them here. Like that's my argument. I don't think it's as like
Right.
he's quite as weird about it, to put it bluntly, as Miller is. He doesn't have this whole nerd theory of it. But I think he'd say, yeah, look, people want to come here, people want what they want. I think Trump assumes everyone's fundamentally selfish, and so you want a better life, sure. But I also don't like your kind. I can tell just, I mean, he literally said this a few weeks ago, Trump, didn't he? He said, you can you can tell some people are low IQ by looking at them. And it's just like a pure distillation of anti-black racism. And I think that would
Yes.
that would be Trump's attitude. Like some people just aren't as good as others. And yeah, sure, they probably want to come, and I'm not going to like use this highfalutin language about it, but I also just don't want them here. That would be my guess as to Trump's thought process.
Well, right, but I think there's also a subtle difference with Miller, in addition to that being his view. By the way, he
No, that's
has
that's
said,
that's Trump's view that I sketched. I think.
yes,
I think Miller goes a bit further. Probably, I think
right.
Mike
So, so,
goes a
so
bit
Trump has
further.
actually confirmed. Yeah. So Trump uses phrases like "shithole countries." He blames, people who have immigrated here for the poor conditions that they fled. He says that everyone who's trying to enter the country is trying to scam us, right? Everything is zero sum. If an immigrant enters the country, it's got to be taking away something from Americans, not contributing something.
Trump's
So,
Trump's just like an old school scam artist who also happens to be a virulent racist, and those two do go together quite often.
yeah,
I
right.
think Musk and Miller have this narrative about Western civilization, which is,
Yeah.
I would say, inescapably linked to whiteness in their heads. Only whites are capable of producing civilization. So they have this whole other level of like old school fascist batshittery built into it as well. Is my
Right. There's a crude version of that in Trump's head, which is the shithole country line, right?
Yeah,
Anyone who's
true.
coming here is to blame for the conditions that they left behind because they're inferior people. They couldn't produce the successful societies that Western Europeans and Americans have produced, that sort of thing, right? But in addition to all that, Donald Trump is perfectly fine with the idea of a almost like a non-white servant caste, right? If people from quote unquote shithole countries are inferior to white Western Europeans and Americans, um, they can at least do tasks that we need done, right? And so you actually see a legitimate difference between him and Stephen Miller on exactly this point. So, for instance, last spring or thereabouts, somebody put it into Donald Trump's head, the last person he talked to who he respects or who he thinks is rich and should needs to be listened to or whatever. The last, he went out and tweeted something like, "Our great farmers are getting screwed because they're losing all these workers who have been." Who have worked on their farms for many, many years. We're going to put a stop to that. Right. And so Donald Trump is capable of understanding that immigrants who are here to function as servile, oppressed, a servile oppressed working class, can actually exist here in ways that are legitimate, right? Somebody's, making money off of their labor, I guess might be one way to put it. And so when Donald Trump did that, Stephen Miller really went to work very quickly to kill it. He stopped Donald Trump from exempting farm labor from deportations, and the whole MAGA media machine cranked up and beat the living hell out of Donald Trump over this idea, and they got it killed pretty quick. And so there's an actual difference there, right? Like Stephen Miller, these people are committing a civilizational crime against us. And to Donald Trump, he's like, okay, well, you know, these people are inferior to me and inferior to the people I respect and so forth. But if they want to, work as slaves for interests that I care about, like, I don't really think that's such a big deal. And that's a legitimate ideological difference between him and Stephen Miller, I think.
It does seem, though, like the more lunatic type of fascist is winning out, because
Yes.
um I think to maybe parallel that with the UK case, UK politics has been driven by anti-immigrant sentiment for quite some time now, and it's been profoundly negatively impacted by it for 10 years, say, since the Brexit decision, which was an anti-immigrant decision. And there's been the sort of mainline Tory view of there's too many immigrants. We're not a big fan of um sort of multiculturalism or whatever. We're definitely pretty anti-woke. We don't want British people to feel challenged, that immigrants would take their jobs. At the same time, you know, here's some work, here's a bunch of visas for like farm work or care work or something. We're not, you know, like we'll tank the economy for a bit for this, but like we understand that the sort of more menial work we can have people in to do that. And then increasingly, what's emerging as the social consensus is that we need mass deportations. And the UK is actually becoming more radical than the US than this, not just of people who came here illegally, but of all migrants to the UK in the last 5 or 10 years. Like they all need to go. We essentially need to the Tory party actually, not even reform, just floated a proposition that would deport about 5% of the British population, not 5% of immigrants, about 5% of our population. And the idea that is that only people with English or British heritage legitimately belong here, and everyone else has to go. Um, and so even the people who were very anti-immigrant and were willing to do economic harm in order to enact anti-immigrant policies, now even they're being outbid, and we have, rather than the vision being of a society in which white people sort of have all the good jobs reserved for them. Now the vision really is of a society only of white people. And in the US, I don't know if you saw the tweet from the DHS that said,
I was just going to bring that up.
but why don't you tell us about that? Like, just briefly what that was.
Sure. Well, I was going to say, 5%, you're lucky because, our fascists want to deport one-third of the US population. And what I'm referring to there is that the Department of Homeland Security's official Twitter feed tweeted out a picture of paradise, palm trees and a beach, and it essentially said, "This is what America will look like after 100 million deportations."
And one
Now,
might note that there are not 100 million immigrants of any description in the US. 100
right.
million is the size of the non-white population.
Yeah, I was going to point out, in fact, that it's actually quite a small fraction of that 100 million are undocumented immigrants. Estimates that are, I think, pretty good have it at around 14, 15, maybe 12 million. And so we're talking about around 85 million people who they want to deport who are not undocumented immigrants. And we are, I think, pretty clearly very deep into talking about lots and lots of US citizens. And by the way, we should note that Donald Trump, who was the president, has said repeatedly that all Somalis have to go. He has said that in numerous cases. And so these are people who, in some cases, are US citizens or legal permanent residents or lawfully here in many other ways. And it's just a purely ethnic and racial basis for deciding who gets to belong at this point. That's where we are.
How do we prevent a rerun of the sort of, but I didn't really mean that dynamic that we've already seen? Because I don't think when you tell people what the stated goals of this movement are, I don't think they believe you. I think, I
Right.
was talking to a bartender in the UK who's Australian, and he has indefinite leave to remain. So he's legally here. He can be here for as long as he wants. And he's saying, oh, I think the anti-immigrant stuff is bad, but it doesn't affect me. And I sort of had to, no, it does. Like if Reform or the Tories win, they're, maybe they don't actually go all the way through with it. Their position is that you have to go. And he was really shocked that I said that because this is like a business owner. The bar's his. He's doing pretty well here from what I can tell. He's been in the UK for 10 years. He's married here. Like what I was saying that like depending on how the next election goes, they may try and forcibly remove you from the country. Was like I think it just sounds so wild that like he struggled to catch up with it a bit. And even with everything that's happening now, like, how do we? I think America's doing better. I think at least like the liberal half of the aisle, like your Democratic primary voters and so on, they get it. They get that these are real fascist far-right freaks and they need opposing at all costs. But like, I don't know, like, how do we make sure we don't fall into the same thing again of like, let's at least be eyes wide open about what these people are telling us they plan to do?
Well, this actually, what I'm going to say here actually answers some of the stuff you raised earlier as well about public opinion. So,
Mm,
we are, and I can only answer this in the U.S. context, and maybe you could shed light on whether it applies in the European and British context as well. But we are stuck with a real problem, which is that on this issue, opinion is very thermostatic. And essentially, what that means is that the middle of the country, independents, moderates, low information voters, and voters who are not particularly engaged in politics at all, the way you and I are, um, they essentially just get bombarded by lots and lots of information and imagery, and they just kind of get pushed one way. They get pushed to and fro, largely by what's in the information stream and also by um, impressions of or by an awareness of who's in power at any given moment. So, we had this big debate among Democrats about whether Biden's overreaching on immigration. He probably let many more people into the country than he obviously let many more people into the country than Donald Trump did. His border was subject to, very large flows, and that's a whole separate set of debates. But on the other hand, Biden also did really pretty rigorously enforce laws as well, and arguably, actually did some good things on the issue, like created parole programs for people from Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, etc. But so we had this argument among Democrats. Did that lead to Donald Trump? Or, in one formulation that's often used, it's sort of a disgusting one, but I'll float it here. If liberals won't secure the border, then voters will pick fascists to do it for them. Right? That's sort of the formulation. And there's like a tiny kernel of truth to that. And this is the essence of our problem. So, you know, voters don't like disorder and suffering among immigrants, right? Toby, does that make sense? They are so when Biden's in office, what they see are images of people crossing the border. They
mm.
see people getting picked up, arrested. They see fights breaking out maybe here and there. Right-wing propaganda is pushing information into their streams about that. And they just kind of say to themselves, okay, well, we need to kind of get this under control. And whoever's in charge right now isn't getting it done. So let's switch, right? Let's just switch. And this is kind of why there's not a rigorous evaluation of what that alternative is actually telling voters that they intend to do. Does that make sense? And so this is a serious problem, and we should probably apply this way of thinking about it to what's happening now, right? Like, so Trump's in power. Voters are seeing lots and lots of imagery of disorder and suffering. It's a different type of disorder and suffering. It's much worse, but they're now thermostatically turning against Trump. And I think there's probably a tendency for people like you and me to be a little too heartened by the public turning against Trump. Like, I'm glad the public's turning against Trump, right? On this issue. Like, it's good. And I really think the public is showing very good pro-immigrant values. But on the other hand, part of it is just thermostatic reaction. And
I don't think we can count on it in
yeah,
and of itself enduring into, say, another Democratic administration. I think that the
right.
rational expectation would be if none of our other narratives or structures would change, the thermostat will just swing back the other way. I think I think we have to at least challenge those information structures.
Oh, for sure.
I think I'm not
For
saying
sure.
we don't accept. Obviously, we accept the thermostatic backlash now that it's benefiting us. But I think if we just sort of passively absorb it without trying to at least impart some sort of framework to people of like, you're seeing this suffering and chaos and it's bad, but here's why, you know.
In fact, that's what my second big piece is about. I had another piece that I think we were going to talk about here at TNR.com, folks who want to check it out, on how Democrats can kind of reset this issue. And I'm
Yeah, I
100%
was
with
setting you up for that. So
you.
tell us about that.
Right. So 100% agree that opinion is very thermostatic, but that shouldn't lead us to throw up our hands and say we can't have any impact on it. Like, so the public is getting a very vivid look at what fascism looks like on the streets and in practice, right? A very vivid look at what treating immigrants as criminals and civilizational threats really means. And the public is recoiling at that, both superficially reacting to the violence, but also on a deeper level, rejecting, as Joe Rogan does, these ideologies which hold that immigrants are fundamentally a threat to, the social contract in the United States. Right. So, in order to try and seize control of this debate, Democrats have this opening to essentially say, you know what? They say immigration's bad. We say immigration's good. They say that all you can have is violence and disorder and suffering. We say that the system can actually be managed in the national interest in keeping with a genuine sense of what's in the national interest, not some crackpot set of ideologies about Western civilization. Like, we need more immigrants for, in the case of labor shortages, we need more immigrants to stave off population decline. We need more immigrants in order to combat the aging of the workforce. We need more immigrants to pay more money and taxes into upkeep of the social safety net and taking care of our elderly, which is pretty damn expensive. Like, if you sit in a doctor's office for an hour and you're surrounded by 30 people who, are retired and getting medical care, like right now we've got millions and millions of people trying to beat down our doors saying, let me contribute money to your economy and to your tax coffers to pay for medical care for your elderly. That's what they're saying, right? They're saying, please let me join your social system and pay into the system to keep the elderly people, alive for longer. And we're saying no, or Trump is saying no, get out, right? You can't come in. And so Democrats have an opportunity to say, immigration is what we need and it can be managed. But this is where I'm pessimistic. Unfortunately, I just think the thermostatic nature of this debate and the degree to which people are disengaged and pushed around by information that gets pumped into their algorithms or whatever, those things are going to make it hard to win this debate in any kind of permanent way. We are going to be swinging back and forth kind of wildly between fascism and violence and mass kidnappings, and then something, which maybe looks to some people like a lax border and maybe more generous humanitarian policies, I don't see how we win this debate long term.
Let me maybe offer uncharacteristically a bit of optimism. I think it is also a matter of structures. I'm, you know, I had a post a while ago where someone was like, oh, this sort of reactionary centrist idea of like, oh, the pivotal voter needs a carefully calibrated policy platform of XYZ. And I sort of posted, the median voter believes that there is a button on the president's desk that lowers the price of eggs, and they refuse to push it to spite them personally. And that is
Yeah,
surprisingly insensitive to who the president is. Like the new one comes in, you get a 6 month pass, and then you start to get mad at them for not pushing the egg button, you know?
yeah.
What I would say is I think to some degree we can blame voters for not taking this as seriously as they should. I mean, like 40% of
Oh,
the
yes,
country
yeah,
doesn't vote, so you can start there, and then a lot of the ones who do so in perhaps a way that doesn't always have the seriousness that we would hope for. Certainly, you can blame them. But also, those egg button voters did not descend from heaven fully formed. They are a result of the types of political and media structures that we have allowed to sort of grow in our countries
yeah,
without
yeah.
any real thought for like are they good or wise, or even just what are the logical consequences that we would expect from this? So, in the US right now, to scroll through social media casually, much more in the UK actually, is to just be underneath a Niagara of anti-immigrant propaganda, right? Most voters associate immigrants with criminality, but that's because the most common modifier used of the word immigrant in the press is illegal, right? That the median voter believes that immigrants commit more crime, that they take their jobs, and that they come here illegally. But that is what you get from casually scrolling your news feed. Now, it's not that there aren't articles saying immigrants are good, actually, but they're just in a minority. They're in a profound minority. And
Okay,
I,
can I throw in a slight nuance and a bit of an objection here?
please,
Um, so I agree that there's probably a fairly real instinct towards those views among median voters. But I also think that these convictions or impressions, maybe is a better word, are extremely shallowly felt
I agree.
and and extremely shallowly held, right? And are very quickly supplanted with a set of convictions about immigrants that you and I hold. Something like most immigrants are well meaning, most immigrants are just trying to improve their lives, most immigrants just came here to get a better life, most immigrants like American institutions. Heck, that's goddamn why they came here, right?
Well,
Like,
a lot of swing voters believe all of those things and all the things I was saying simultaneously, you know?
yeah, right. Yeah.
And I'll give you an example from the UK. 45% of British voters support an end to all legal migration, right? Pretty radical view. That number
Is that
dropped.
really that high?
Yeah.
My
Um,
God, you guys are screwed.
oh, we're much worse than you. I could go on. But here's the optimistic part. That number drops to 15% if you tell people it would lead to NHS staffing shortages, which it absolutely would, by the way. So just a simple provision of a bit of factual information reduces that very widespread and very extreme view by 2/3, right? And I think we can. The problem is both easier and much, much worse than we imagine it. It's easier because these are not, for some people, the Stephen Millers of the world, certainly. And I think in any country, there's like 15% of white people who are just irredeemable, absolutely fucking irredeemable, and there's nothing to be done with them. But I think there's this sort of broad middle that probably hasn't thought about it very much, and they're just regurgitating what they get from right-wing press. And actually, it doesn't take very much to push them off that. Maybe not to get a full come to Jesus moment, but just to get a like, from like, we don't want anyone coming in to, yeah, no, actually, now I've thought about it, we do need some people coming in for the NHS. You know what I mean? Like that journey. So it's actually in some ways much easier. It's much harder because all that negative information that they're getting about immigrants, the reason they say, oh, we should stop all that inward migration, is because there is so much. If you think about like the amount of eyeballs that get the anti-immigrant stuff gets versus the amount of eyeballs that pro-immigration articles get, you've probably got at least an order of magnitude difference, if not two, right? And
Yeah.
so what that speaks to is, I think, one, a persuasion challenge, but two, just a structures challenge. We need to build up, and I think this is happening in the US to a degree, it's not in the UK. We need to build up structures that are clearly calling out the failures of the other side and also offering a counter narrative of our own. And like, I think what we kind of don't get on our side is we also have to flood the zone. Like, it's not enough to just do like a little article every now and again that fact checks Stephen Miller's lying. Like, we need the volume of propaganda, to put it bluntly, on our side that they have. And I think if we do, then it's in play. But I don't think we can just. I don't think. I think if we don't fix the structures, like how people consume their social media feed, the sort of, like I said, this mismatch of the volume of propaganda on either side of the immigration debate, that is. I think if we don't fix those structures, then yes, we should expect the thermostatic thing to just continue. But as you say, it's not as if the median voter is a locked-in nativist. You know, it's just that's what they've heard.
I
Anyway,
mean, I agree 100%. In fact, there's almost a proof of concept happening in the United States right now in the form of all the attention that's being paid to ICE violence and murder and kidnappings and so forth. We are seeing in real time an experiment in, you know, concerted information warfare. And I wrote about this in the piece that that we discussed earlier, the one on how Democrats can kind of reset the immigration debate. J.B. Pritzker, the governor of Illinois, Democrat, has been quite innovative on this stuff. His city, or his a city in his state, Chicago, was hit by one of the first ICE invasions of the first year of Donald Trump's term, and it was violent stuff, vicious stuff, nasty stuff. And this was when Donald Trump and Stephen Miller were strutting around like a couple of conquering generals who thought that the public would rally to their side no matter what. And J.B. Pritzker, much to his enormous credit, called on people, ordinary people, to film this stuff with their phones. This is an interesting move by a public official, like a governor of a large state. He did this repeatedly. He said, "Film the stuff. The world needs to see what's happening here." And fortuitously, what we saw as a result of that was a real experiment in information warfare. And right now, ordinary people are using that little device that they carry around in their pockets to beat the right-wing propaganda machine. Each person contributing one little bit of information. And it's created this deluge, to use your kind of imagery, that's overwhelmed their propaganda. And, you know, the bad news, though, about this is I'm not sure how you replicate something like that in a more conscious way. Like, yeah, and this goes to the fundamental problem we face in the real lack of conviction or deeply held sentiments on the part of so many ordinary voters. You need big events that are happening in the real world to punch through to people what's actually, a set of values. And if you don't have those big events, I don't know how you replicate it, right? Like, so do we even know how effective right wing propaganda really is? I don't know. I think,
I think it's reasonably effective, at least for the
yeah,
people who it targets.
well, right, but so yes, it certainly is, and in the United States, Democrats absolutely need to up their information warfare game and understand that the state of our information ecosystems, the disastrous state of them, is a major problem going forward. But on the other hand, as I think we're getting at here, a gazillion bots tweeting that, immigrants are a threat to Western civilization or whatever, or a gazillion bots saying, look at that criminal eating your dog, right? Instantly gets supplanted by reality when it's kind of vivid and powerful enough. It's
But
like
I
an
mean,
instant.
I think that just is the fight, though. Like, I don't think there's a world where we don't have that fight. That is the fight. And look, there is another team at play here, and they
Agreed.
can win. But like, yeah, it's difficult because of just the scale of what we're going up against. I mean, I think a sort of more robust alternative is emerging on our side. New Republic has been pretty aggressive about covering this. Uh, I also write for an outlet called Liberal Currents, which has gone from like being a trendy blog to I think in a year will actually be a major news institution. It's just skyrocketed. You could think about even on the sort of centre right, something like the Bill Kristol's Bulwark has got a lot of eyeballs on it now in a sort of like more centrist anti-Trump direction. There's a few others I can mention. But even relative to a year or two ago, there is a sort of emerging anti-fascist media system. It's still in total number of eyeballs, fairly weak compared to both the sort of wish-washy centrists and the fascists. But it's come a long way in a year. I could imagine in another year or two, it would come further because there is a market for it right now. Like the median Democratic primary voter wants to fight. They don't want to hear this both sides hand wringing. They believe correctly that these are fascist freaks and they want their media to share that same analysis. So I think we've got a hell of a long way to go, and I think we're coming from behind. But I don't know, I'm not in the US case, I'm not totally despondent.
Right, neither am I. I think the degree to which we've been able to get the correct interpretation of Trump's fascism into the public discourse, getting it to penetrate to places that you might have thought it might not be able to get to, mainstream media, so forth and so forth, has been somewhat successful. I 100% agree with that.
I mean,
And
I'd almost say we've punched above our weight. We
yeah,
who
I
call
look,
who call Trump a fascist do not have the media footprint that the centrist hand-wringers do. We do not have the media footprint that the far right does. But at least within the Democratic primary base, at least within our side of the aisle, we've won that debate. We've won that debate with less resources. We have, I mean, also just Trump being an absolute monster has helped, certainly. But like it is also a persuasion thing. We have talked people into considering this an existential threat. And we've talked people into a much more, robust defense of migrants and so on. I think where we've been less good um, is reaching these sorts of median voters or low information voters or partial voters. I think we've been quite successful at persuading like pre-plugged in liberals to adopt our view. And I think part of that is also structural. Like, we need to get better at having a YouTube presence, having a TikTok presence, having like a Facebook Shorts presence, meeting people on the platforms that they're at. But that doesn't seem like an absolutely insurmountable hurdle to me, but it does. I think we've done a good job at like selling our own team. I think we're still falling quite short on selling the sort of middle, if that makes sense.
yes. In fact, I might even go a little further than you in the punching above our weight department, if I could.
Yeah.
I think not only have we won the debate more or less on our side of the aisle, you actually see institutions like the New York Times and the Washington Post, and well, the Washington Post is certainly not what it was, but it's another story entirely. But I think it's actually also seeped pretty deeply into the mainstream media as well. A lot of prominent and influential reporters and commentators, I think, accept the analysis that Trump is fundamentally a fascist, that he constitutes an existential threat to the American experiment and so forth, and to liberal democracy. Now, that gets a little diluted by the conventions of political reporting, which kind of push towards faux neutrality and so forth. And your readers, your listeners will be very familiar with that. But in some basic way, we've gotten our analysis of the situation to be a fairly dominant one, I think, right? And so that is a cause for, I think, some optimism and maybe a little celebration. But this is where it breaks down for me a little bit. The as successful as the information warfare being fought against ICE has been, as successful as all these ordinary people creating this avalanche of true video footage about what's actually happening, as successful as that's been in, countering right-wing propaganda, the problem is that you need real world events, right, to do that for you. So let me give you an example. Renee Good is a mom in Minneapolis who was recently shot in the head by an ICE agent and killed in absolutely horrific circumstances. A poll from Quinnipiac soon after the event found that 82% of registered voters had seen video of this incident. Now, that's obviously heartening, right? So lots of people took video of this incident from different angles that overwhelmed the rights and White House propaganda by telling the truth about the event and countering efforts to distort what had happened. And it's reached more than 8 in 10 Americans. But to get that done, and this is where I get a little pessimistic, and I need you to talk me out of that. It's hard to see how you duplicate that kind of penetration absent something incredibly jarring and riveting and deeply, deeply disturbing. Does that make sense?
It does. I mean, if you want me to talk you out of it, I can counteract your pessimism with more pessimism. Is that
Thanks.
there will be more horrific events over the next few.
Great. Yeah, there we go. Good point, actually.
You know, this isn't going away anytime soon. And I think it's hard to know in advance exactly what we'll like. George Floyd was not the first person killed by police under, totally unjustifiable circumstances. That has happened. Something quite similar to that's happened before. That was just the straw that broke the camel's back. That was the one that stuck. Renee Good, I can think of perhaps some things that really made that a thing that stuck. But there's other there's all sorts of examples of ICE cruelty and overreach, and some have just really taken off. It's kind of like this organic thing that isn't fully controllable, but there will be more, and others will stick. That I can promise you. I
I
think,
understand, but Toby, we need, masked roamed thugs, patrolling cities and driving down urban boulevards in
well,
tanks.
here's what I think our job is. And here's you've put the challenge to me, and I'm not normally the optimist. I'm normally the one telling guests why they shouldn't assume things will just get better by themselves. But I think here's what the challenge is. I think this is so pervasive and so grotesque, and is hitting ordinary Americans, not just at an intellectual but an emotional level. I think people are seeing this and sort of feeling in their gut, as it were, this is wrong. Maybe not everyone, but enough, a majority, right? I think what we have to do is take that sentiment, take that revulsion, and translate it into a long-term stain on the political right. And I'll give you an example of how that looked like when it was successfully done. In the 70s, when we had around the world some centre-left governments, we had a period of high unemployment and high inflation simultaneously with the Volcker recession, the oil embargo, and so on. There's all sorts of macroeconomic stuff going wrong, and that's tough. It's tough both when there's not a lot of jobs and stuff is getting more expensive. Because like one you can sort of deal with, but both together are hard, and people felt it viscerally. And what the political right managed to do is translate that sentiment into a feeling that has persisted both among media commentators and among electorates around the world that the left is not to be trusted with the economy. That the left might have good intentions. They might be nice people. They might, even be who you want to take care of your healthcare or your education. But my God, they cannot be trusted to run the economy of a modern
Yeah,
state. Right?
it's interesting.
And
Yeah.
for as long, and they did that successfully. And I would say they did it successfully with less factual basis. Because if you want to get into like the weeds of why was there macroeconomic turmoil in the 70s and early 80s, it's way more complicated than just left-wing governments spent too much, right? But nonetheless, that was like a label that the right successfully put on the left that kind of stained us for really until the modern era. Like, even with, I would argue, both Bill Clinton and Barack Obama being more successful macroeconomic managers than their Republican counterparts, there was still this feeling that maintained that when it came to the economy, the Republicans, the right, were the grown-ups in the room, and they could, and you see it in polling. When you ask people whose policies do you prefer, they prefer Democrats. But if you ask them who do you trust to manage it more, they say Republicans, right? And that for 50 years we've had that now. What we need to do is take this emotion, this revulsion, this discontent with what are, as we've said, the predictable consequences of nativism. And because this isn't, we're going to have this for years now, right? This isn't going away anytime soon. And we need to like put that label on the right such that for five decades, when people think about the right, they think they can't be trusted with immigration systems because they fuck them up. Because these are people whose instinct is to be cruel and exclusionary. And actually, we want the grown ups in charge, people who make rational decisions, people who balance interests, people who think about the long run good. You know, the not trusting Republicans on economics, the not trusting the left on economics thing was never purely rational. It was just this emotional thing. And I think we need to do the same to them on immigration. I think we need to reverse it. Now, that isn't just going to happen, but I think it can happen. I think what the right did to us on economics is proof of concept. I would actually also say the left did that to the right on economics a century ago. After the Great Depression, we successfully made the case that the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl and all that was a result of untrammeled capitalism and you know and we for 2 generations we made the case that the
Right, and
right
Republican lack of concern for the poor and people affected by the economy.
blah 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 blah. So these are
Yeah.
examples of like you've almost like slurred an entire movement. You've stereotyped them as like not to be trusted with this. What I want to see out of this is for as long as I've been alive, we've trusted the right more on immigration because there's been an implicit assumption that what you need to make an immigration system work is you need to be tough. And I want to flip that, and I want to have for the next 2 generations, they're not to be trusted because they're cruel. And actually, what you cannot have in these systems is cruelty. You want sober minded, compassionate people. Anyway, that was very long, but that's what I think has to happen.
I think that was all really well put, and I think it's a really important mission just to keep injecting pessimism into the discussion. I think there's a structural problem we face, which looks a little like this. So it's very hard to explain to people what the fundamental problem with the immigration system is. Okay. And in the U.S. context, the basic problem is that illegal immigration is caused by uh, a lack of ways to immigrate legally, right? And for a lot of people, that's a tough thing to conceptually grasp, but it's the fundamental thing we face. And Republicans and the right understand this and exploit it very skillfully. In fact, so here's an example of that. During the run up to the 2024 election, Republican governors sent enormous numbers of migrants by bus up to northern cities, I guess places like Chicago and New York. And the media was, of course, this was catnip to them. These images of mobs of migrants roaming around with nothing to do, nowhere to go, desperate mobs essentially straining social services to the breaking point and stuff. But the kernel of insight at the core of that Republican move was that um, Republicans win if the system seems unmanageable, right? So they never let Democrats fix the system, right? So fixing the system would require some combination of, more border security, restrictions on asylum to prevent people from showing up at the border and then disappearing into the interior, some version of that, offset by new humanitarian pathways for people to come here from afar without having to show up at the border, an orderly way to make legal immigration work. That's the answer, basically. It's not wouldn't be perfect. There will be problems, but that's fundamentally the answer. And Republicans know that, which is why they won't let Democrats make legal immigration easier in any sense, even though it would solve the very problem Republicans claim to care about, which is disorder in the system. And so the reason they do that is because they want the public to think immigration is fundamentally unmanageable. And this is a hard structural problem for us to counter. How do you persuade people that more legal immigration is the answer to illegal immigration when you never get the chance to demonstrate it? That's a problem, Toby.
It is, but do you not think also a lot of what people are responding to in the immigration debate isn't real? Like, like,
Well, yeah,
like
sure.
I
But
I used to live in Carlisle in the UK, which is 99% white, and you'd hear people talk about being swamped by migrants, right? They're not getting that from anything that's happened in their lives or even in
right.
statistics. It's they're getting that from the right-wing press, you know? And, I think dominating information space is part of it. I also think, do we not despair sometimes of our ability to make arguments? Like, Republicans are running on a problem they caused. Seems like something we can say. Like, yeah, there's all sorts of problems with the immigration system. They won't let us fix them. Like,
So arguments matter, though. Like I think that's the essence of the challenge, or this is the essence of it, right? Do
oh,
arguments matter, or does a masked guy shooting someone in the face matter?
I mean,
That's
both.
that matters. Arguments matter less.
I mean, I probably think so. I probably think the core of politics is emotional. I don't want to say arguments don't matter at all.
Right.
I think we're at a moment of right overreach now, and we have a capacity to capitalize on that. Most of which probably will be emotional, but I don't think it's bad because of that. I think, the murder of Renee Good was genuinely horrifying. I think what we're seeing with ICE right now is genuinely like disgust and revulsion is the correct an appropriate reaction, and we're not wrong to utilize that disgust and revulsion in service of a political project to ensure it doesn't happen again, or that it is at least mitigated.
Okay, I'm going to try to switch to optimism now and
Okay.
offer a scenario in which your understanding of this does come to pass, okay? A theoretical or a hypothetical one.
Yeah, and I should say
So,
I don't know that we'll win. This isn't me saying
right,
I think
understood.
victory is definite, you know?
But well, what I mean by that is I'm going to offer a hypothetical in which we do manage to create the durable impression among many voters that Republicans can't be trusted to handle this issue again. All right. It would look like this. So imagine a Democrat wins the presidency in 2028, wins both the Senate and the House at that point. Like hard, but not impossible. But just imagine it for now.
Hmm.
The first thing that they do is they say, you know what? Our immigration system has been a disaster for far too long. It's caused enormous tragedies in this country, enormous waste of human potential, and so forth. We are going to fix it. And we don't give a shit what the right says about it. Fuck off. Right? You screwed this up. Right? And then they, end the filibuster to pass something through the Senate with a majority, simple majority. They pass the same thing through the House, and the president signs it, right? So it's some combination of, fixing the asylum system with some form of restrictions that maybe you and I wouldn't like, but might be necessary. Um, Legalizing most long-time residents, maybe 10 years or more, whatever the threshold is. Creating more sensible pathways for people to come here in a kind of in a situation where they have a real claim to asylum, kind of like an orderly asylum system, right? They restore humanitarian pathways, other ones like temporary protected status and refugee status that Trump is erasing, and the system suddenly looks a little more functional, and they say Republicans can never be trusted again on this issue. They told us and tried as hard as possible to make the system fail so that they could exclude all these people. We're legalizing them, giving a chance to get right with the law, giving them a chance to pay taxes into our system, to fund health insurance for our aging population. This is the way forward, and never ever give them power again to do what they did to us during the Trump years. That's and so I guess there might be a way you could get there that way.
I mean, I almost think what would sell that is I think as soon as Democrats start doing any of that, you'll be very much in danger. Now I'm being the pessimist of the sort of like thermostatic reaction against it, right?
Oh, right, there will be one. That's the thing.
I
Yeah,
think
there
I
will be.
think like if you're doing it right, you've laid the groundwork. Not that you're making the case then that Republicans can never again be trusted, but you've by the time you're willing to do those reforms, you've made that case. You've already put that label on them. And you almost sell what you're doing in the negative of like whenever Republicans attack what you're doing, which they will viciously and hysterically, your counter isn't almost like a detailed defense of them. Your counter is these people can never again be trusted with this. And in many ways, that
I
was
like it.
that was sort of the defense of like Thatcherism and Reaganism was they did stuff that was very controversial. They passed all sorts of policies that didn't have majority public support. But in many ways, what they ran on is this is what needs to happen because the left fucked it up so bad. This is what, and you need to stay with us because the left can never again be trusted on us. And because
Right.
by the time Thatcher and Reagan came to power, they'd already done the groundwork of like the press and the public kind of bought that, it flew. Now, if you haven't done that groundwork, it won't fly. But I wonder if the way you sell that is not a substantive defense. Whenever they come up with something, you say, yeah, of course they're going to raise concerns. These people are liars. They lie about this. They are cruel. They are malicious. They can never again be trusted. You almost just stay on the offense, even when you're out of opposition. I can see something like that working, but I think we would have to do the groundwork of like successfully smearing them first. But I think,
And
yeah,
yeah,
go ahead.
I 100% agree. But of course, then back to pessimism. Let's say we both get our way. Like, let's say Democrats successfully persuade the public that these people are deeply sick. They pathologically hate immigrants in a way that most normal people don't. And as a result, they unleashed enormous havoc and violence and death and wasted human potential on our society for years and years for no purpose other than their cracked ideological fantasies about Western civilization and so forth, right? So we convinced them that these people can't ever be trusted to manage this issue again. They unleashed terror on our streets. They had their goons killing Americans. They had, prison camps and so forth. Never again, right? So we get that part, and then we also get my part, which is, you know, Democrats actually pass a series of reforms, end the filibuster, whatever it takes, get it done. We're the ones who finally fix this. So that's our ideal world, both of us, right?
Right.
Even then, you'd still have a thermostatic effect kick in. Now, what I like about the way you're talking about this is you're leveraging the thermostatic nature of this issue to our advantage, only on a kind of bigger historical sweep, right? You know what I
Yes.
mean? Like you're talking about taking the thermostatic nature of this and making it even bigger, right? And I think that's great. I love it. I mean, I hope we can do that. I
I'm
don't
not
know if
saying
we
we
can.
can. I'm not saying we will. I'm saying like
Yeah.
that's at least a plan. You know,
No, I think it's a good plan,
because
and you know,
if you want to tell the story of economics, you could say the story of the last 100 years is of two intergenerational thermostatic backlashes. There was a thermostatic backlash to the Great Depression that was felt to discredit the right on economics, that goes all the way through into what, like the Great Society era. Then there was a thermostatic backlash to the stagflation of the 70s that then did the opposite, that then gave us two generations of feeling like the left can't be trusted on economics. And in neither of those cases, I would say, was did it just happen? Both of those had to be like argued for, and that people made it their life's mission to create those views, right? Um, I'm wondering if there can be something similar. I'd say we're two generations in to a sort of view that the left are too nice to really be trusted with immigration. And I'm not sure has that come from rising immigration or has it just come from, media dominance on this? I'm not sure. But I wonder if there's another. I think what we're seeing now is so grotesque. And I think it's not hypothetical to say that people can be made to feel a sense of revulsion and horror at it. People are feeling a sense of revulsion and horror at it. That's what I'd like to see. Do we get there? I don't know, but that's at least a way forward. I think just thinking, oh, we'll elect a Democrat in 2028 and things will sort of get better by themselves. I think we have very good reasons to think that they won't. I think a larger argument has to be made here.
yeah. Well, as I tried to lay out in my piece, there is a major opportunity here to completely, redominate and recast this entire discussion, right? And
Mm.
then, of course, we get into other potential problems, which is you're going to have, let's face it, a class of Democrats out there who are going to be reluctant to unwind Trump's prison camps and
Yeah.
are going to be real, right. And so, that is going to be a real potential problem,
What
a
do we
real
do about
potential.
what do we do about those? Because we are winning the abolish ICE debate. Like all the progressives are sold now. Pritzker just came out and said we need abolition and accountability. It seems like the older members of the party, not like in terms of like biological age, but just like I always find people who were elected after 2016 tend to get it a bit more, whereas people who've like been in elected office since the 70s tend to have to like unlearn a style of politics. It's the
Mm.
older ones and it's the leadership. Like like Schumer gets a lot of hate online, perhaps more than is deserved, but it's not totally undeserved either. Like, what's going wrong with them and how do we fix that to close with?
Yeah, well, look, I think that's an extremely big problem. I guess I'm not really entirely sure how you resolve this problem because you're going to still structurally have the problem where Democrats are representing much more moderate areas than, you know, or some Democrats are representing much more moderate areas than other Democrats are, right? Like this is just sort of structurally built into the Democratic coalition. It's broad. To get to Senate dominance, you have to win in some tough states, right? That's just the nature of it. But I guess what I would say is that I think maybe a spirit of compromise among Democrats is the way to get there. To essentially say, look, we can fall into this vicious factional war over exactly, whether to use the words abolish ICE, whether to free every person in the prison camps or leave them there, right? We can fall into that kind of vicious factional conflict and throw away our opportunity. Or we can say, you know what? We have this amazing chance to take charge of this debate once and for all, to break the opposition's hold on it, to break the fascists' hold on it. And this is, of immense importance, maybe even world historical importance, right? To go a little too grandiose. And we've got to come up with a series of compromises on exactly how to unwind Trump's system that all people in the Democratic coalition agree with, rather than treating this as a fight to the death set of litmus tests. And I think maybe if we can persuade people to act constructively and in good faith on the understanding that neither side's going to get exactly what they want from the unwinding or the post-Trump era, and how to deal with what Trump has left behind. Still, it's a better outcome if we can reach a set of compromises on that and then break the opposition's hold on this issue than it would be to throw away this historic opportunity by engaging in vicious factional conflict. I think there's potentially a way forward there.
See, I think they're going to have to be pushed a bit. I think.
Yeah.
I think there's going to be three steps. One, win. The good news is we've done the first of them. One is win supermajority opinion among the Democratic primary electorate. Done. They're 80-90% abolish ICE. Second, get to clear majority public opinion, and that's happening. It's at I've seen abolish ICE at 47% recently, but if you could get that to 60, that kind of takes away the excuse of, oh, I'm running in a more centrist district. And then three, I think a few people are going to have to be made examples of. I think the Republican Party really shifted with the Tea Party when Eric Cantor got took out. I, I, I just to kind of send a message, not because he's evil or deserves it, but I'd kind of like to see AOC kneecap Schumer. I think a couple of people, I think a couple of people are going to have to be hit over the head to bring them in line. But then I think if you take out a few, the rest will fold. And yeah, we can compromise on what we call it or whatever. But I think I think the Democratic primary base is overwhelmingly with us, and it will probably be necessary to leverage that fact as just power politics. Like the people who put you in office agree with us. I think that will. I don't think we'll have to primary every Democrat. I don't think that's possible. But I think if we make an example of a few people, I think that will probably have to happen.
Yeah, well, look, if that's necessary, then so be it. I'm sort of temperamentally a little, I guess, uncomfortable with a lot of the factional conflict that happens between center and left in the Democratic Party, but that may be possible. I do think that we can't underestimate the size of the obstacle that we face here, which is this kind of instinctual caution, this consultant class control over a lot of the elite democratic calculus that we all lament all the time. It's powerful stuff. It's going to be hard to shake it off, but it can be done. And I agree. Whatever's necessary to do it, we should do it.
Cool. We ran over a bit, but that was a great chat. Should we end it there?
Sounds like a plan. Really enjoyed it, man.
Yeah, no, that was fun. Give listeners anything you want to plug. We've talked about your some of your recent columns, but I don't know if you have a website, podcast, any social media to follow you on.
Sure. Well, I'm on Blue Sky at Greg Sargent, and I have a daily podcast for the New Republic. It's called The Daily Blast. It's 20 minutes of quick stuff, and it's fun and easy, and we promise you no small talk. So you check that out. And you can find me at tnr.com. My stuff is on there. That's the New Republic. That's the New Republic's website, tnr.com.
Cheers, Greg. Appreciate it.
Great to talk.